Usually when we talk about like getting a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of absolute precision. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah, completely. It feels almost like engineering.
Right. You fall, your arm hurts, the x-ray shows this jagged white line, and the doctor just points to the screen and says, well, there's the fracture.
It's very binary. It's either broken or not broken.
Exactly. It's comforting because it's so visible. We inherently want complex problems to have visible, singular causes that we can just easily categorize and, treat.
Which works great for a broken bone,
Yeah.
but it totally falls apart for other things.
Yeah, exactly. Like if you look at something like neurodevelopment or chronic autoimmune conditions, that x-ray machine is entirely useless.
Right, because you're suddenly looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky.
You don't have one broken bone. You have like a dozen different interconnected systems. Hormones, environment, genetics, stress all just slightly misfiring.
And compounding on each other.
Yes, compounding until the whole body just crashes.
It's the transition from a simple mechanical failure to a complex system failure. The symptoms don't point to one obvious root cause.
Because the root cause is the system itself.
Right.
Acting against its own balance.
Exactly. And that's exactly what we're talking about today.
We are taking that exact concept today, that murky, compounding, invisible kind of systemic failure, and applying it to an entire world. For everyone joining us on this deep dive, I want to set a scene for you.
It's a pretty dramatic scene.
It really is. Imagine a highly interconnected, globalized landscape. You've got monumental architecture, international trade routes spanning thousands of miles.
Massive empires.
Yeah, powerful empires engaging in like complex diplomacy, enforcing treaties, driving the sprawling economic engine. It's a world that feels completely permanent.
But it wasn't.
No.
Yeah.
Because then, in this terrifyingly short window of time, the lights just go out, cities burn, and are left completely abandoned.
Whole populations basically vanish from the archaeological record.
The actual ability to read and write disappears entirely in certain regions for centuries.
We're looking at the late Bronze Age collapse.
Right, a period roughly between 1200 and 1150 BCE.
It really remains one of the most complete and rapid breakdowns of human civilization in recorded history.
We're examining some really fascinating research today from a document titled Bronze Age Collapse.pdef. And what I love about the source is that it doesn't view this collapse as some primitive, ancient disaster.
Right. It's not a story of people just forgetting how to farm.
Or being conquered by a single unstoppable enemy. Instead, it dissects the mechanics of the event as a textbook complex system failure.
And it even employs this really unique lens. It explores the collapse from the perspective of a systems architect, the sort of subpersonality in the text named Tommy, who is trying to understand how massive projects break under their own weight.
Which serves as a brilliant framework for our mission today. By deconstructing the Bronze Age collapse, we aren't just doing a post-mortem on ancient history.
No, we're looking at the blueprint of how deeply entangled networks operate.
Because the mechanics of this ancient collapse hold some genuinely eerie parallels to the hyper-interconnected world we navigate right now.
It's a shortcut to understanding our own vulnerabilities.
Exactly. So to understand how a machine that massive breaks, we first have to understand how incredibly advanced it was while it was running.
Right. We have to look at the peak.
Yeah, roughly between 1400 and 1200 BCE. We aren't looking at isolated tribes here.
Not at all. We're dealing with a literal club of great powers.
Break that down for us. Who are the major players here?
Well, you have Mycenaean Greece dominating the Aegean. Then you have the Hittite Empire controlling vast stretches of Anatolia, what is modern-day Turkey, and parts of Syria.
And Egypt, obviously.
Yes, the new Kingdom of Egypt, which was arguably at its wealthiest and most culturally dominant. And then you have the incredibly prosperous city-states of the Levant.
Places like Ugarit, right.
Exactly. Places along the Mediterranean coast that served as the crucial trading hubs between these massive empires.
See, when I used to think of ancient history, I just picture these empires as existing in their own little bubbles, maybe occasionally clashing on a border, but mostly ignoring each other.
That's a very common misconception.
But the source material shows that the level of integration here is staggering. They used a shared diplomatic language, Akkadian, to communicate.
Which is wild when you think about it.
It is. It means a scribe in Egypt and a scribe in Anatolia had to learn a foreign language just to handle international relations.
The Amarna letters provide a perfect window into this. We have this archive of diplomatic correspondence on clay tablets found in Egypt.
And they weren't just like arguing over borders?
No. These kings engaged in this deeply complex, highly formalized exchange of luxury goods. They arranged royal marriages to cement alliances.
Didn't they call each other brothers?
Yes, they actively referred to each other in these letters as brother kings. It was a very deliberate, carefully cultivated international community.
They were bound together diplomatically, but the real glue was the economic engine running beneath all this brotherly affection. The research describes their primary economic model as a palace economy.
And for anyone raised in a modern market economy, you really have to shift your mental gears to grasp this.
Yeah, explain how that actually worked.
Well, it's entirely alien to how we operate today. In a palace economy, there is virtually no private enterprise or free market.
Wow, zero.
Basically zero. Everything is highly centralized. Imagine the state as this massive, inescapable funnel.
Okay, so if I'm a farmer back then.
If you're a farmer, your surplus grain doesn't go to a local market to be sold to the highest bidder. It flows directly up to the central palace administration.
The same goes for everyone else, right?
Exactly. The textiles produced by weavers, the tools made by artisans, it all goes to the state as taxation or tribute.
And then the palace just hoards it.
Not exactly. The palace bureaucracy, which was massive, by the way, and meticulously recorded every single transaction on clay tablets, they redistribute those goods back down the chain.
So they're the ones handing out the paychecks, essentially.
Right. They provide rations to the workers, supply the standing armies, and provision the specialized craftsmen. The state dictates production, collects the results, and controls the distribution.
I mean, it sounds incredibly efficient on paper. The central authority knows exactly how much grain exists and can direct it precisely where it's needed.
It is very efficient, but top-heavy efficiency comes at a severe cost. It offers zero flexibility.
What happens if there's a hiccup in that central office?
That's the problem. If that central redistribution mechanism stumbles, let's say a bureaucratic failure means the administrators can't issue rations or transport is disrupted, production halts entirely.
Because the local farmer can't just pivot and sell his goods to a neighboring town.
Exactly. The entire localized economic engine freezes because the only gear turning it is the palace.
And the most critical, vulnerable gear in that entire international machine was bronze. This brings us to a concept the text calls the bronze dependency trap.
This is such a fascinating part of the puzzle.
It really is, because bronze wasn't just like a luxury item. It was the foundational material for weapons, for agricultural tools, for everything.
But making it requires two distinct ingredients, copper and tin.
And getting those ingredients was not easy.
Not at all. Copper was relatively accessible. It was heavily mined in Cyprus. But tin was the bottleneck of the ancient world.
It's incredibly rare. Right?
Very rare. To get the tin necessary to forge bronze, these empires had to rely on supply chains stretching deep into Central Asia.
Like modern-day Afghanistan.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
Or to the very far reaches of Anatolia.
So you have this material that every single society absolutely requires just to function, but the ingredients are separated by thousands of miles of land and sea.
Right.
I was thinking about this like modern semiconductor manufacturing. If the highly specialized microchips from one specific facility in Taiwan suddenly stop shipping because of a localized crisis.
The entire global assembly line freezes.
Exactly. Car manufacturers in Germany and smartphone companies in California suddenly can't put out a product. That was bronze. You needed both ingredients, meaning literally no region was self-sufficient.
That interdependence defined the late Bronze Age. The stability of the entire system relied on an uninterrupted, daily flow of maritime and caravan trade.
Which is pretty mind-blowing for that era.
It is. We actually have evidence from shipwrecks like the Uluburun found off the coast of Turkey, which dates to this period.
What did they find on it?
That single ship was carrying copper ingots from Cyprus, tin, Canaanite glass, Egyptian jewelry, ivory. It was basically a floating microcosm of this globalized economy.
See, if I'm looking at this sprawling, interconnected web of trade and diplomacy, my instinct is to think it's strong.
Sure, that makes sense.
Yeah, I'd assume that a vast web of trade acts as a safety net. Like if Egypt experiences a terrible harvest, the Hittites or the Mycenaeans could theoretically cover the shortfall. The connections should make them resilient, shouldn't they?
That is a very logical assumption, but it is precisely the trap of complex systems.
Okay, unpack that for us.
The research points out that in this specific configuration, high interdependence actually created deeply systemic vulnerability. They had optimized for peak efficiency.
So every part of the system relied on the other parts functioning at maximum capacity.
Right. They lacked redundancy.
They completely lacked it.
Exactly. It's akin to perfectly aligned gears in a massive factory. If one gear slips, the whole machine jams. They didn't have localized, independent systems that could absorb the impact if the main trade routes failed.
So they traded resilience for efficiency,
Yes, there was no buffer for a systemic shock.
which means beneath the monumental architecture and the wealth of the Brother Kings, the foundation of this world was agonizingly brittle.
Very brittle.
So moving into the decades leading up to the collapse, roughly 1250 to 1200 BCE, the society looked invincible on the outside, but underneath, the pressure was compounding.
The documentation identifies a slow, quiet strain building across multiple domains of society long before any actual collapse began.
Right. It wasn't one spectacular failure. It was a compounding of structural weaknesses across 7 specific areas.
Let's walk through them. First, you see profound social inequality.
The wealth is heavily concentrated at the very top among the palace elites.
Exactly. The farmers and laborers who are entirely dependent on that palace redistribution are stretched incredibly thin.
And their loyalty to the state is tied strictly to their own survival, not necessarily to some shared patriotic national identity. If the rations stop, the loyalty starves.
And managing that unrest becomes impossible due to the second factor, political over-centralization.
Because all decision-making power is hoarded in a single palace center.
Right. So any weakness in leadership, like a succession crisis or just an incompetent king, creates a total bottleneck. The local provinces don't have the autonomy to solve their own emergencies.
Then you add in the third pressure, the economic strain of those fragile resource lines, the tin and copper routes we discussed.
And on top of that, there's a fascinating fourth domain the research highlights: the erosion of religious and ideological legitimacy.
This part is so interesting to me, because in these societies, a king wasn't just a political administrator. He was fundamentally viewed as divinely sanctioned.
Yes. In Egypt, the pharaoh's literal job was to maintain Ma, the cosmic order and balance of the universe.
That creates an incredibly dangerous ideological trap for leadership, doesn't it?
It really does. If the king's authority is based on his ability to maintain cosmic order, what happens to the public worldview when the crops fail for 3 consecutive years?
Or when raiders burn a coastal city and the king's armies fail to arrive.
It goes way beyond physical hunger or fear. It triggers profound cognitive dissonance.
The cosmos is broken. The fundamental agreement between the ruler, the gods, and the people is voided.
Exactly. The legitimacy of the entire system was inextricably tied to its continuous success. When the success faltered, the legitimacy didn't just weaken, it evaporated.
People lost faith in the very concept of the palace economy.
Yes, so you have inequality, centralization, fragile trade, and ideological doubt. Then you factor in the fifth element, strained militaries.
Because armies rely on that centralized state logistics network. If the state is running low on resources, the defense forces become weak and fragmented.
And the sixth is restricted technology. The knowledge to make bronze was heavily guarded by elites.
And finally, the seventh strain, which we haven't even touched on, the constraint of incredibly slow communication.
This is a variable that is really hard for us to fully appreciate today. Literacy was a specialized skill, restricted almost entirely to palace scribes and the elite class.
There was no public dissemination of news, no broad awareness of regional events.
More importantly, information traveled at the physical speed of a walking messenger, a donkey caravan, or a sailing ship.
Which introduces a massive information lag. By the time a centralized ruler sitting in Atusa or Mycena receives a clay tablet warning of a crisis on the frontier, the information is weeks old.
The border has already been breached.
They couldn't adapt quickly enough to fast-moving crises because they were always reacting to the past.
Which is a terrifying way to run an empire.
The research uses this vivid metaphor to describe these decades of compounding pressure, the loaded spring. I found this incredibly helpful.
It's a great visual.
Don't think of late Bronze Age society as a crumbling stone wall where you can clearly see the mortar failing and bricks falling out. Think of it as a massive, tightly compressed metal spring.
The tension is immense.
Right. The people are compliant, but exhausted. The economy is rich, but brittle. The religious beliefs are outwardly strong, but quietly fracturing. Everything on the surface still functions, but the tension locked inside the system is agonizing.
That tension is the inviolable vulnerability. None of these hidden weaknesses, the slow communication, the rigid economy, the social unrest, would have destroyed the system on their own.
They were chronic conditions, not fatal wounds.
But together they created a society perfectly primed to fail. They had stripped away every layer of resilience.
All it needed was a a shock strong enough to release the spring. And between 1200 and 1175 BCE, that shock arrived in three devastating waves, all originating externally.
The first wave was ecological. We have extensive paleoclimate data like pollen core samples from lakes in the region and stable isotope analysis from cave stalagmites.
That's amazing that we can track that.
It is, and it clearly indicates a massive, decades-long climate shift across the eastern Mediterranean. We're talking about severe, prolonged drought.
Which immediately translates to crop failures. And in a society entirely dependent on agricultural surplus to feed a centralized labor force, a multi-year drought is an absolute existential threat.
It wasn't just a bad season. It was a sustained change in the climate that these highly tuned agricultural systems simply could not handle.
And then came the second shock.
Yes, the second external shock was geological. The archaeological record shows widespread, severe seismic activity during this exact window.
Scholars refer to it as an earthquake storm, right?
Exactly. It's a phenomenon where a major tectonic event triggers a chain reaction of massive earthquakes along fault lines over a period of decades.
So the very infrastructure of these monumental cities is being physically shaken apart right when they are already struggling to feed their populations.
It's brutal. And then you have the third shock, which has historically been the most famous and heavily dramatized, the arrival of the Sea Peoples.
The Sea Peoples, yeah, whenever you read a basic summary of the Bronze Age collapse, it almost always centers on them.
It's definitely the most popular narrative.
The traditional story paints them as this apocalyptic, mysterious armada of seafaring warriors who just arrived out of the mist to burn civilization to the ground.
It's a very evocative image, and it was largely fueled by ancient Egyptian propaganda. Ramses III commissioned massive reliefs at Medinet Habu depicting his glorious victory over this invading confederation.
But the modern research explicitly dismantles this myth, doesn't it?
Totally. The Sea Peoples did not single-handedly cause the Bronze Age collapse.
They weren't the root cause. They were a symptom of a larger breakdown.
Exactly. The historical consensus now is that these groups, the Shirdan, the Peliset, the Luca, and others, were very likely displaced populations.
So they were refugees.
Yes, refugees fleeing from the exact same systemic collapses, famines, and droughts in their own homelands. We see evidence of them migrating with ox carts and families, not just war fleets.
Wow. Ox carts and families, that really changes the picture.
It really does. Yes, there were opportunistic raiders among them who recognized that the coastal defenses of these great empires were suddenly weak, but they were acting out of desperation, not launching a coordinated global conquest.
So they were the final blow to a system already falling apart from the inside. Instead of asking how a ragtag group of refugees managed to topple the greatest empires on Earth, the better question is, why were these massive empires suddenly so fragile that a wave of migrants and raiders could push them over the edge?
And the answer is that loaded spring. When the drought and the earthquakes hit, the system lost its capacity to defend itself.
Let's trace the actual mechanics of this. How does a drought in Anatolia or a raid on the Levantine coast lead to a total, system-wide civilizational reset?
It plays out as a terrifying cascade failure, a true domino effect. Let's look at the steps outlined in the source. Step 1 is the climate shift causing severe drought, which radically reduces agricultural output.
Less food in the fields means less surplus flowing into the funnel.
Which triggers step 2. The palace redistribution system fails. The state simply does not have the grain to feed its massive, specialized workforce or its standing armies.
And when the state can't provide rations, you reach step 3. Famine drives massive internal unrest and migration. Desperate people abandon their fields and move toward the cities or the coast, searching for survival.
And as millions of people are displaced, you get to step 4. This mass migration leads directly to conflict and coastal raiding.
The Sea Peoples, alongside local populations turning to banditry.
Right. They attack the wealthy coastal trade hubs because that's where the remaining resources are hoarded.
Once the ports are burning, step 5 hits. The long-distance maritime and land trade routes become incredibly unsafe and eventually cease functioning entirely.
Which leads inevitably to step 6. The flow of vital resources, specifically tin from the east and copper from the west, stops.
The bronze dependency trap snaps shut. Without tin, there is no bronze.
Which brings us to step 7. The centralized palace economies, entirely deprived of their primary technology, their luxury goods, and their agricultural base, completely collapse.
The bureaucrats have nothing left to count and nothing left to distribute.
Step 8 follows quickly. Without resources, weapons, or food, The standing armies dissolve or turn into marauders themselves.
leaving the major urban centers completely defenseless.
Leading to step 9. Cities are either violently sacked by invaders and internal rebels, or they are simply abandoned by populations fleeing into the countryside to revert to subsistence farming.
And finally, step 10. All regional communication and coordination dies. The political map fragments. Public trust in the concept of central authority hits absolute zero.
That's the full cascade.
The research frames this using an analogy of a massive, intricate machine. It doesn't explode like a bomb. A bomb is a sudden, localized destruction.
Right, this is much slower.
This is a complex machine where one gear, the food supply, slows down. Because that gear slows, another gear, the trade routes, misaligns. The lubrication keeping the whole thing running is public trust and governance, and that dries up entirely.
The machine just starts to grind.
Yeah, it makes an awful structural noise. Smaller components start snapping, and eventually the machine simply seizes up. It stops functioning.
That is the hallmark of complex system collapse. It is a positive feedback loop. A failure in the climate causes a failure in agriculture, which causes a failure in economics, which destroys the military, which invites invasion, which further destroys the agriculture.
It is an unrecoverable spiral.
Truly unrecoverable.
Now, we've laid out the macro level view, this vast geopolitical cascade, but what I keep trying to conceptualize is the lived experience.
Yeah.
What did it actually feel like for a merchant in Ugarit or a farmer in Mycenae to wake up every day while the world ended?
The research spends time exploring this psychological reality, and it's quite haunting.
It's vital to understand that the experience of collapse was highly uneven. There wasn't a single definitive day where an official decree went out saying, hey, the Bronze Age is over.
You didn't flip a calendar page and welcome the Dark Ages.
No. For the everyday person, the breakdown occurred in 3 distinct psychological phases. Phase 1 is simply unease.
During this phase, it doesn't feel like the end of the world. It feels like a temporary crisis.
Right. You experience a poor harvest. The palace demands heavier taxes to compensate. You hear strange rumors from traveling merchants about coastal cities being attacked.
But the dominant psychological force here is normalcy bias.
Normalcy bias is so powerful. We assume that because the system has always functioned and recovered in the past, it will inevitably correct itself this time. You think, this is just a rough patch, the king will handle it.
But then the system doesn't correct. It degrades into phase 2, disruption.
This is when the daily routine shatters.
Exactly. The expected grain deliveries from the palace just don't arrive. You go to the local market and there is nothing to trade. Violence and theft spike locally because the palace security forces are stretched too thin or have deserted.
The psychological mindset shifts rapidly from mild unease to active distrust, stockpiling, and sheer survival.
Which eventually forces phase 3, adaptation or flight. You are left with a brutal choice. Do you stay in a starving, increasingly violent city and risk dying in a raid?
Or do you abandon your ancestral home, pack whatever you can carry, and become a migrant yourself?
And ironically, as millions choose flight, they add to the pressure on neighboring regions, accelerating the cascade.
But what I find truly mesmerizing about this period is how the leadership, the elites sitting in their palaces, experienced the collapse.
They were enveloped in their own fog of normalcy, perpetuated by propaganda.
The denial of the elites is just staggering. You have a highly centralized, top-down society. The kings rely heavily on projecting an aura of divine control.
Right, their legitimacy depends on it.
As their territories are literally burning, as their international trade networks are evaporating before their eyes, many leaders simply commission new monuments. They ordered their scribes to chisel inscriptions boasting of great victories and perfect cosmic order.
It borders on pathological denial. But from a systemic perspective, propaganda is a desperate tool to maintain social cohesion. The leaders had to maintain the illusion of control for as long as possible, hoping the populace wouldn't realize the palace was empty.
But that illusion was fatal because of the information lag we discussed earlier. Think about a king sitting in a fortified palace. He receives a message that a coastal port is under attack.
So he spends a week organizing a military response and dispatches an army.
But because communication is so slow, that port actually fell 2 weeks ago. The refugees from that port have already moved inland, consuming resources the army was supposed to use. He is issuing orders based on a reality that no longer exists.
The research frames this as the outdated map analogy. It perfectly captures the profound perceptual lag of a collapsing system.
Yeah, imagine you are trying to navigate a dangerous landscape. You are relying on a map that clearly states cross the river at this stone bridge, and find shelter in the walled city just over the hill.
But in physical reality, the bridge washed away a month ago, and the city was abandoned last year.
The people of the late Bronze Age, especially the leadership, were trying to navigate a crisis using a mental map of reality that completely failed to match the physical reality on the ground.
And that perceptual lag is the most dangerous element of any systemic collapse. A system can be structurally broken, it can be functionally failing across multiple domains, while the people operating inside it still firmly believe they are in control.
By the time society fully recognizes that the system is collapsing, the tipping point is already in the rearview mirror.
It's entirely too late to intervene.
That is a genuinely terrifying realization when you map it onto our current global supply chains or political systems. You don't know you've driven off the cliff until you are already halfway to the ground.
And the Bronze Age powers hit the ground incredibly hard. But the narrative doesn't end with destruction.
Right. When the dust finally settled around 1000 BCE, the old world was completely gone. But humanity didn't end. Civilization radically transformed.
Let's examine the aftermath.
The immediate post-collapse period is characterized by a massive systemic vacuum. The highly centralized, top-heavy palace economies vanished.
The sprawling, long-distance trade routes for bronze were dead.
And most shockingly, the actual writing systems disappeared. We mentioned earlier that the ability to read and write was lost. In Mycenaean Greece, they used a script called Linear B, and it just vanishes from the archaeological record.
It is a profound cultural amnesia. But to understand why it vanished, you have to understand what Linear B was. It wasn't used to write poetry or record history or codify laws for the public.
What was it then?
Linear B was an accounting script. It was used exclusively by palace scribes to track taxation, inventory, and redistribution.
Oh, wow. So it was basically just a spreadsheet.
Precisely. When the palace economies fell, the accountants either died or dispersed. There was no longer a massive centralized inventory to track, so the tool used to track it was simply discarded.
The society didn't need it to survive in the new, localized reality. Power had shifted away from these top-down palaces to highly localized, tribal, survival-based structures.
So the economy shrinks from international shipping networks to local subsistence farming.
But the research points out a fascinating silver lining in all of this destruction. The argument is made that the collapse of these complex networks actually forced a necessary innovation.
It forced the adoption of iron.
Which brings up a good point. If iron is so superior and abundant, why weren't they using it during the Bronze Age?
Iron is abundant. You don't need a multi-continent trade network to find iron ore. You can often find it locally, but it is much harder to work with than bronze.
Because of the heat required.
Yes. It requires significantly higher temperatures to smelt and much more complex forging techniques. During the peak of the Bronze Age, there was no incentive to develop iron technology because the bronze trade was so efficient and deeply entrenched.
The system was locked into its own technology.
But when the trade routes fail and the tin stops flowing, you can't make bronze anymore. You are forced to figure out how to forge the metal you have in your own backyard.
So the collapse of the international network forced the democratization of metallurgy. Iron could be produced locally, which meant a small village no longer relied on a centralized palace or a global trade network for its tools and weapons.
They became completely self-sufficient.
Wait, so you're telling me that losing their ability to read and write and losing their entire economic structure actually paves the way for a more resilient future?
The research uses the metaphor of forest fire ecology, which illustrates this perfectly.
I love this analogy. Let's break it down.
The late Bronze Age was like a magnificent, ancient, old-growth forest. The canopy was incredibly dense and interconnected, but it was so thick that it choked out all the sunlight.
Nothing new could grow beneath it.
Exactly. The collapse was the massive forest fire that burned away that top-heavy canopy.
And the immediate aftermath of a forest fire is just ash and devastation. It looks like the end of the world.
But that fire clears the space. It returns nutrients to the soil. And most importantly, it lets the sunlight reach the forest floor.
So out of that ash, new, highly adaptable and more resilient species begin to emerge. Species that simply could not have survived under the shadow of the old canopy.
And historically, we see exactly that. Out of the ashes of the Bronze Age, we see the emergence of the Phoenician maritime networks, which were far more flexible and decentralized than the old empires.
And we see the rise of the smaller, independent Greek city-states. Because they weren't locked into a massive, rigid palace economy, these city-states eventually had the social flexibility to experiment with new forms of governance.
leading to early democracy and classical philosophy.
The systems that emerged from the Dark Age were explicitly shaped by the failures of the past. They traded the massive, brittle scale of the Late Bronze Age for the flexible resilience of the Iron Age.
They built systems that could bend without shattering.
This philosophical pivot brings us to the final portion of the research, which applies all of this historical data to a modern psychological framework. The document introduces a specific lens from a subpersonality named Tommy.
Tommy is described as the cartographer of the breaking world. He views the historical events through the perspective of a creator, a systems architect, or a world builder.
Tommy is someone who builds massive, complex systems in his own life, whether those are organizational projects, creative worlds, or software structures. And his deepest underlying fear is that his own creations will become so unwieldy, so heavily structured, that they will eventually collapse under their own weight.
He looks at the ruins of the Bronze Age and sees his own anxieties reflected back at him.
And he extracts 3 core lessons from this historical tragedy, translating them into design principles for modern systems.
The first lesson is, complexity needs flexibility. A system that cannot bend will break.
If you optimize a structure purely for stability, efficiency, and maximum output, stripping away all redundancies, you are building a fragile palace. You have to design for evolution. You have to leave room for imperfection and slack in the system.
The second lesson Tommy pulls is, collapse is not the end of meaning. Even when the palaces burn, even when the administrative writing is forgotten, the cultural memory remains.
The stories of the Bronze Age survived orally and eventually became the myths of the Iliad and the Odyssey. People adapt. The system fails, but the human capacity to derive meaning and build a new world from the fragments endures.
And the third lesson is perhaps the most profound instruction. Build anyway. The Bronze Age proves definitively that even the most magnificent, deeply interconnected, perfectly engineered systems can and will eventually fall.
Entropy is undefeated. Nothing is permanent. But the response to that terrifying reality isn't paralysis. The response isn't to stop building.
The response is to build with the conscious knowledge that it won't last forever. You design the system so that when it inevitably breaks down, it breaks into usable pieces that the next generation can pick up and use to build something better.
You build worlds that can survive being broken.
It is a remarkable synthesis of ancient history and modern systems theory.
I want to connect this directly to you, the listener, right now. You don't have to be studying ancient history to apply this. Think about the systems you interact with daily.
Whether you are leading a startup, managing a massive corporate team, designing a piece of software, or just organizing the daily routines of your own personal life.
Ask yourself how you are building. Are you optimizing purely for maximum efficiency? Are you stripping away all your buffer time, your emergency funds, your redundancy, just to maximize daily output?
Because if you are, you're building a late Bronze Age system.
You are constructing a loaded spring. Are you building a fragile palace, or are you building an adaptable Iron Age village?
It is the ultimate diagnostic question. Because the core philosophical thesis of this entire exploration is this: complex systems do not fail because they are weak.
They fail because they are strong in the exact wrong way. They become too interconnected, too efficient, and completely devoid of the necessary redundancy to survive an unpredictable shock.
Let's take a step back and look at the massive journey we just went on.
Yeah, we started in a dazzling, hyper-connected, globalized world. A landscape dominated by brother kings, massive palace economies, and sprawling international trade networks for bronze.
But beneath the glittering surface, it was a tightly wound spring, quietly strained by wealth inequality, resource dependencies, and rigid centralization.
Then the external shocks hit. A prolonged climate shift causing drought, massive tectonic activity, and waves of desperate migrants.
Because the system had prioritized efficiency over flexibility, it lacked the redundancy to absorb the impact. That triggered a devastating, unstoppable cascade failure across agriculture, trade, military defense, and public trust.
The perceptual lag, the fog of normalcy, kept the elite leadership locked in denial, while the everyday people watched their reality shatter.
But out of that terrifying vacuum, out of the ashes of that civilizational forest fire, humanity adapted. They transitioned to localized iron production, dismantling their fragility and growing back far more resilient than before.
It is a complete cycle of systemic death and rebirth. But there is one final thread from the research that we haven't pulled yet. And honestly, it is the most unsettling element of the entire collapse.
We've talked extensively about the visible triggers, the multi-decade droughts, the chain reaction earthquakes, the desperate raids of displaced populations.
But the text hints at one more terrifying multiplier. A silent killer that accelerates systemic failure but leaves almost no trace in the archaeological record: disease.
When you look at the conditions of the Late Bronze Age, it is the absolute ideal environment for a pathogen.
You have massive, hyperconnected, long-distance trade routes spanning continents, ships moving constantly from port to port.
And then a prolonged drought causes widespread multi-year famine. The population is suffering from severe malnutrition, which fundamentally compromises their immune systems on a mass scale.
You have terrified, starving populations fleeing the countryside and crowding into walled cities or refugee camps. They are connected by global trade with absolutely no immune defense and no understanding of germ theory.
It is the perfect storm for a pandemic.
Huh.
But because we don't have explicit surviving medical records or a confirmed mass grave with identifiable plague DNA from this exact moment, it remains a shadow.
It's the ghost in the machine of the cascade failure.
It forces a deeply uncomfortable question. How many historical societal collapses were quietly accelerated or even pushed past the point of no return by invisible pathogens that simply dissolved into the soil?
Leaving us to forever wonder why the armies fell so easily.
It really leaves you thinking.
When we look at our own hyper-efficient, highly interdependent global networks today, our supply chains, our international travel, our tightly packed urban centers, what unseen vulnerabilities are quietly traveling along those very same pathways right now?
Just adding tension to a spring that is waiting to snap.
Something to mull over as you navigate your own complex systems today. We'll leave you with that thought.